Excellences, chers collègues, la 9748e séance du Conseil de sécurité est ouverte. L'ordre du jour provisoire de la présente séance est la situation au Moyen-Orient. L'ordre du jour est adopté. Conformément à l'article 37 du règlement intérieur provisoire du Conseil, j'invite le représentant du Yémen à participer à la présente séance. Il en est ainsi décidé. Conformément à l'article 39 du règlement intérieur provisoire du Conseil, j'invite les intervenantes et intervenants suivants à participer à la présente séance. Monsieur Hans Grundberg, envoyé spécial du secrétaire général pour le Yémen, Madame Joyce Msuya, secrétaire générale adjointe aux affaires humanitaires et coordinatrice des secours d'urgence par intérim, et Madame Najat Jouman, professeure et membre du conseil d'administration de la Jouman Trading and Investment Company. Il en est ainsi décidé. Le Conseil de sécurité va maintenant aborder l'examen du point 2 de l'ordre du jour. Je donne à présent la parole à Monsieur Hans Grundberg.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, as I address you today, the military escalation in the Middle East that we have witnessed for a year now keeps intensifying and risks spiraling out of control. Countless lives have been lost, and pain and sorrow have spread through the region as hopes for progress seem distant. Regrettably, Yemen is part of this escalation and risks being further dragged in. During this period, the safety of United Nations personnel has been increasingly at risk. It has been a particularly difficult year for United Nations personnel in the region. In Yemen, Ansar Allah continues to hold United Nations personnel, civil society workers, and staff of diplomatic missions in arbitrary detention. With all this said, I echo the urgent call of the Secretary General. An immediate ceasefire and regional de-escalation is needed to halt this widening conflict. Madam President, Yemen and its people are already feeling the impact of this escalating regional conflict. Since my last briefing to this Council, Ansar Allah has continued their attacks on international shipping and made multiple attempts to target Israel with missiles and drones. These repeated attacks, including the recent strikes on tankers, have significantly increased the risk of an environmental disaster, a disaster that was narrowly avoided after the attack on the motor vessel Sunyon. Such attacks on civilian shipping are wholly unacceptable and must cease immediately. The Red Sea is a global waterway, and it should be a safe passageway for the benefit of all. In response to these attacks, there have been US-led airstrikes on 4 Yemeni governorates, as well as Israeli airstrikes on Hodeidah. The reports of casualties in Hodeidah and damage to the city's critical infrastructure are concerning. This cycle of retaliation is pulling Yemen deeper into the regional conflict, jeopardizing its hopes for peace and stability. Moreover, it distracts from the urgent needs to address Yemen's own international crisis. Yemenis continue to yearn and work for peace after more than 9 years of conflict, which has ravaged the country, displaced millions, separated families, and shattered the economy. And yet they see their space for meaningful engagement and peace-building under attack, with arbitrary detentions, death threats, and intimidation, especially in Ansar Allah-controlled areas. I call on Ansar Allah to immediately and unconditionally release all those arbitrarily detained, including 17 United Nations personnel, 4 of whom are women, and 1 of whom is from my own team, and to end their campaign of detentions. I am counting on the support of this Council in sending this clear message. Madam President, I recently spoke with several civil society organizations, women's groups, activists, and local peacemakers, and they told me how deeply they have been affected by the latest wave of Ansar Allah arbitrary detentions. These detentions, compounded by vague and false accusations and the total lack of any due process, aim to tarnish reputations and create a climate of fear and mistrust. The latest reported referral of some of the detained to so-called criminal prosecution is a further blow to our collective efforts to build peace and stability in Yemen. I have repeatedly told Ansar Allah these kinds of actions do not signal an interest in negotiating peace. Civil society actors and human rights defenders continue to play a critical role in addressing the urgent humanitarian needs and fostering social cohesion. They deserve strong protection measures and international support to continue their work safely. Madam President, since my last briefing to this Council, I have engaged in constructive discussions with Yemeni and international stakeholders during visits to New York, to Tehran, and to Moscow. In addition to requesting support for the release of the detained, my engagements have reaffirmed two critical messages that I wish to share to this Council. First, a peaceful resolution of the conflict in Yemen is not only the most viable way forward, but more importantly, it is definitely achievable. Second, the Yemeni people require sustained and unified international support, and we must collectively keep the focus on making peace a reality. These are not just mere aspirations. We have the elements and the tools to prepare the ground, and allow me therefore to elaborate. First, we have the commitments made by the parties towards the establishment of a roadmap, including a nationwide ceasefire, addressing humanitarian and economic needs, and preparing for an inclusive political process. Despite the escalation, these commitments remain the essential building blocks for peace in Yemen, and the reference points for our discussions with the parties. In support of such discussions, this month, my office initiated political dialogue sessions with Yemeni political party representatives and components, as well as civil society organizations with a meaningful participation of women and youth. Second, on the military front, we have relative calm on the front lines, despite occasional flare-ups that remind us of the fragility of this situation. Communication channels with senior military leadership through the Military Coordination Committee remain active, reinforcing the message that the groundwork laid now will be critical to ensuring the stability of a future ceasefire and other security arrangements. Recently, we hosted a delegation from the government of Yemen to plan and prepare for the nationwide ceasefire mechanism, and we hope to hold additional sessions with Ansar Allah and other relevant partners soon. Third, on the economic front, we have identified options at the technical level and are working to convince the parties that collaboration on economic issues is the only way to achieve economic viability and stability. We remain in close contact with key stakeholders, particularly in the banking sector, where the potential collapse of a major commercial bank highlights the urgent need for cooperation. Madam President, let me be clear. The tools are there, and I call on the parties to demonstrate the necessary will and to put the needs of Yemenis first. I am, in this regard, looking forward to the briefing of Dr. Najat Juman. Madam President, as we mark the anniversary of the adoption of Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security, we must acknowledge the immense burden Yemeni women continue to carry in this conflict and recognize their bravery. Yemeni women have been at the forefront in driving peace-building efforts for years, and now more than ever it is crucial to amplify their voices. I call on all parties to ensure that women are empowered to shape the decisions that will pave the way for lasting peace in Yemen. To support this, my office, in partnership with UN Women, have to date held specific consultations with over 400 Yemeni women and men to advance a vision for an inclusive peace process in Yemen. The consultations aim to achieve the meaningful inclusion of women in negotiations and to lay the foundations for more inclusive and sustainable peace. These efforts reinforce our commitment to enhancing women's direct participation across all tracks of the peace process. Madam President, my office remains steadfast in pursuing every opportunity for peace in Yemen. The parties must demonstrate their commitments to peace through meaningful actions, including the immediate release of all arbitrarily detained. The need for unity and purpose in and on Yemen has never been greater. I want to underscore again that despite the broader regional conflict, peace in Yemen is still achievable, and we must remain focused on making this a reality. This Council carries the hopes of the global community that conflicts can be resolved through international collaboration and diplomacy. As Special Envoy for Yemen, I convey the expectations of the Yemeni people and urge this Council to unite in stopping the bloodshed and supporting every effort to bring peace to a region in desperate need of it. Thank you very much, Madam President.
Je remercie M. Grundberg de son exposé et je donne à présent la parole à Mme Joyce Msuya.
Thank you, Madam President. And thank you, Special Envoy Grundberg, for his briefing and tireless efforts on behalf of the people of Yemen. Madam President, I would like to start once again by demanding the immediate and unconditional release of the UN personnel, NGO staff, and members of civil society arbitrarily detained by the Houthis since June this year, as well as our UN colleagues detained since 2021 and 2023. We categorically reject the allegations leveled against our colleagues. United Nations personnel should never be arrested or detained because of the work they do in carrying out our mandate. As such, I echo the extreme concern expressed by the principals of affected organizations in a statement on Saturday, 12th of October, about the reported referral to criminal prosecution by the Houthis de facto authorities of a significant number of arbitrarily detained colleagues, including 3 United Nations personnel, 2 from UNESCO and 1 from the UN Human Rights Office, who were detained in 2021 and 2023. The potential laying of charges against our colleagues is unacceptable. The arbitrary detention of humanitarian personnel and the false accusations against them continue to significantly hinder our ability to provide life-saving humanitarian assistance in Yemen. The detentions are reflective of a growing unacceptable pattern of attacks against humanitarians across the region. Humanitarian relief personnel must be protected in accordance with international humanitarian law. Madam President, throughout the past month, the UN has engaged in continuous diplomatic efforts with the Houthi de facto authorities and other interlocutors for the release of those arbitrarily detained, including during high-level week of the General Assembly. I am thankful for the strong support we have received from member states, including key countries in the region. Additionally, we greatly welcome the commitment by member states and donors to continue to support humanitarian assistance across Yemen. As of today, because of continued advocacy, we have confirmed that a majority of the detained UN staff have had contact with their families or relatives. Those requiring health care have received it. We continue to stress that our colleagues must be treated humanely and with full respect for international humanitarian law and human rights, including in regard to judicial guarantees as applicable. Madam President, let me also take this opportunity to extend my condolences to the families of at least 48 migrants who recently lost their lives off the coast of Djibouti. We understand they were returning from Yemen to Djibouti when they were forced off their vessel in open sea by smugglers. According to our colleagues at the International Organization for Migration, 57 other people who were on board remain missing. The UN is supporting authorities in Djibouti with search and rescue operations. To date, 197 people have been rescued and are receiving medical and psychosocial support. 2024 now marks the deadliest year for migrants crossing the sea between the Horn of Africa and Yemen. This incident is a tragic reminder of the dangers faced by migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers along such migration routes. Ultimately, these are challenges that require regional solutions. Madam President, we are deeply concerned about the impact on Yemen's humanitarian crisis of the rapidly deteriorating situation across the Middle East. We are very alarmed by the ongoing attacks from and on Yemen, which has damaged critical infrastructure, including energy and port infrastructure in Hodeidah and Ras Isa. Both ports remain operational and able to receive commercial and humanitarian imports. Power stations throughout Hodeidah city are, however, running at very limited capacity. In response, the UN is providing support to health facilities to ensure the continuation of essential services. We recall that all parties must respect their obligations under international law and reiterate the Secretary General's calls for utmost restraint and for all concerned to avoid attacks that could harm civilians and damage civilian infrastructure. Infrastructure that is indispensable to the survival of the population must be spared. Yemen's Red Sea ports are lifelines for millions of people across the country. It is paramount that they remain open and operational. Madam President, against a backdrop of regional escalation, the humanitarian situation in Yemen continues to worsen, both in scale and severity. Hunger continues to rise. In August, the number of people who do not have enough food to eat soared to unprecedented levels, and severe levels of food deprivation have doubled in areas controlled by the Houthi de facto authorities since last year. Cholera also continues to spread. Since March this year, more than 203,000 suspected cases have been reported, and more than 720 people have lost their lives. Women and girls account for 53% of cases. Partners expect cases to double between now and March 2025. The humanitarian community remains determined to deliver at scale for the 18.2 million people in need. I want to take this opportunity to thank member states and the donor community for their ongoing generous support for the humanitarian response in Yemen. Currently, the humanitarian appeal for Yemen is 41% funded. However, critical response sectors need urgent additional funding. The food security sector quickly needs an additional $870 million. Without this, an estimated 9 million people across Yemen will not receive emergency food aid in the last quarter of 2024. Women and children, IDPs, and other marginalized groups will bear the brunt of the resultant spread of hunger, including heightened protection risks and long-term health consequences. Funding for the cholera response has already run out. Health partners have been forced to close 21 out of 75 diarrhea treatment centers and 97 out of 423 oral rehydration centers. It is estimated that 70% of the remaining diarrhea treatment centers and 42% of the remaining oral rehydration centers will close by December if urgent funding is not received. Long-term funding for gender-based violence programs is also a critical requirement. This is a sector that remains chronically underfunded, with deep lasting impacts on women and girls' safety, dignity, and mental health. Madam President, for too long, civilians in Yemen have suffered because of factors beyond their control. They have endured a devastating decade-long conflict which has upended livelihoods, decimated Yemen's economy, and driven millions of people into poverty and despair. Now, like many in the Middle East, their hopes for a brighter future are falling under the shadow of potentially catastrophic regional conflagration. The only way out is a redoubling efforts for a sustainable peace. I once commend Special Envoy Grunberg for his steadfast efforts in this regard, and I urge member states to do everything they can to support him and to push for the resumption of the peace process and an urgent de-escalation across the region. Thank you.
Je remercie Madame Souya de son exposé. Je donne à présent la parole à Madame Najat Tuman.
السيدة الرئيسة أصحاب المعالي والسعادة السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. شكرا سيدتي الرئيسة على استدعائي لإلقاء كلمتي في مجلس الأمن واهتمام مجلس الأمن بسماع صوت القطاع الخاص في اليمن. كما أشكركم جميعا على شرف الدعوة وعلى اهتمامكم بالاستماع للأصوات اليمنية. إن هذا فعلا أمر مهم، خاصة إن التطورات الأخيرة في اليمن تؤكد أنه قد حان الوقت ليكون هناك مكانة حقيقية لصوت اليمنيين الذين يتوقون للسلام ولصياغة مستقبل بلادهم لكي يكون لها مكانة في تحقيق الرفاهية الإنسانية لجميع اليمنيين. سيدتي الرئيسة أصحاب المعالي والسعادة، بدأت الحرب في اليمن منذ عدد من السنوات، وتوالت الأحداث بشكل سريع ومعقد مما خلق بيئة أعمال مضطربة ومعقدة وشديدة التغيير أثرت على أداء القطاع الخاص بشكل خاص وعلى الاقتصاد بشكل عام. ثم تلتها فترة أخرى من الصراع بأدوات اقتصادية مختلفة ومعقدة، وفي هذه المرحلة تم استخدام أدوات حرب أكثر قوة وفتاكة من حيث التأثير والدمار الاقتصادي والمعنوي لليمنيين. الحرب في اليمن كان لها أثر كبير على الاقتصاد، ففي فترة الحرب المسلحة تضرر القطاع الخاص بشكل مباشر، حيث تعرضت منشآته للدمار، منها المصانع والمخازن وقاطرات نقل البضائع بين المدن، تعرضت لقصف مباشر ما أدى إلى تدميرها وتحقيق خسائر مالية وبشرية واقتصادية جسيمة. مع ذلك استمر القطاع الخاص في القيام بدوره الوطني والاجتماعي والإنساني والاقتصادي، كما استمر في البقاء على موظفيه ودفع الرواتب إلى جانب قيامه بالمسؤولية المجتمعية من خلال تقديم المال والدعم للمتضررين، مع أن الخطوط الاقتصادية في بداية الحرب منها تأثر وآخر توقف تماما. وفي المرحلة الثانية من الحرب فإن أدوات الحرب الاقتصادية التي تم استخدامها وهي أشد فتًا وتأثيرًا على الاقتصاد، حيث أن انقسام المؤسسات السيادية كان واضحًا في سلطات البنك المركزي، وزارة المالية، وزارة الاتصالات، وشركة الطيران اليمنية، وكان واضحًا أيضًا في انقسام السياسات النقدية وارتفاع أسعار الصرف في العملات الأجنبية وانقسام السلطة المالية وتعدد الضرائب وازدواجها، وكذلك تضاعف الجمارك. كما أثرت الأزمة في عام 2024 على البنوك اليمنية التجارية والإسلامية وبنوك التمويل الأصغر. كل ذلك ساهم في ارتفاع تكاليف منح الاعتمادات وامتناع المؤسسات المالية الدولية التعامل مع البنوك اليمنية، كما حجمت الشركات العالمية الكبرى عن التعامل مع القطاع الخاص. كما هاجرت رؤوس الأموال والعقول البشرية وهاجر الشباب والعمالة الماهرة من أطباء ومهندسين وأساتذة الجامعات، كما قام كثير من أصحاب رؤوس الأموال بتصفية أعمالهم لحماية رؤوس أموالهم من التآكل وإعادة استثمارها في الخارج، بما يحرم المجتمع من هذه الثروة في عملية التنمية. ومن هذه التحديات أيضا تعقيد عملية النقل بين المدن الرئيسية
many professors left. Those who had capital also left and decided to invest abroad. There are other challenges, for example, transportation between the major population centers, and this is a challenge because the infrastructure was destroyed and the roads had been closed. And this led to a war economy, and the benefits from that are in the hands of the armed groups, and this deprives the Yemeni people of a better future. There is also an international conflict going on in the Red Sea, and this creates a very difficult economic environment, very difficult for the private sector. This led to the rise in the cost of maritime transport and international transport, which in turn led to the rise in the cost of goods and pushed the private sector and international investors to refrain from investing in my country. We were therefore seriously damaged in this international conflict, where we are trying to see a peaceful horizon here. Countries have a reaction to what is going on in the Red Sea and attacks Yemen. We have to find a solution within the United Nations, led by the efforts made by the Special Envoy Hans Grundberg on that. And we need to make sure that there is peace and stability in Yemen for the Yemeni people. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to express the following recommendations. Urge the Yemeni parties and international communities to support the efforts that are being made by Mr. Grundberg. Urge the United Nations to continue their efforts within the framework of July 2024 so as to attain economic stability more broadly. Urge those who are working for peace and the Special Envoy to continue with their efforts together with the civil society and to enable the reopening of various roads. Urge the parties and the international community to include all of the parties involved in the peace process, the young people in particular, and the women, as well as to have a more equitable distribution of wealth. Those who work for peace and the United Nations to support the Yemeni institutions by promoting the participation of all Yemeni stakeholders in economic and social humanitarian sectors, and urge the international community to support the Yemeni people and manage their funds so that salaries can be paid and invest in infrastructure and training in Yemen. And finally, urge and encourage the international community to help Yemen so as to mobilize the funding that we need for recovery and reconstruction. The private sector will participate in this, and finally create a recovery and reconstruction fund so as to mobilize the finance for development projects. I thank you, Madam President.
Je remercie Madame Jouman de son
exposé. For her briefing.
Je donne maintenant la parole aux membres du Conseil qui souhaitent faire une déclaration. Je passe la parole à la représentante permanente du Royaume-Uni.
Thank you, President. And I'd like to start by thanking Special Envoy Grundberg, Acting Under Secretary General Masuya, and Professor Jouman for your briefings and for your work for peace. I'll make 3 points. I want to start by highlighting the pressing humanitarian need across all of Yemen, as our briefers have already done. Unimpeded humanitarian access is vital to deliver critical life-saving assistance to Yemenis. It is crucial that all humanitarian, UN and diplomatic staff are free from intimidation and threats in order to operate safely and securely. It follows that the detention of aid workers by the Houthis, which has continued for 130 days, and we now understand these detainees may face a so-called judicial process. The use of special political courts will not
result in fair outcomes for the detainees. So we call again on the Houthis to immediately and unconditionally release those detained and provide an adequate operating environment for humanitarians. We call on the international community to stand united in calling for the immediate release of those detained. Second, as an import-dependent country, commercial imports are critical to the livelihoods of the Yemeni population. The import of weapons by the Houthis, in violation of the arms embargo, risks undermining the ability of humanitarian and commercial entities to import goods. This once again demonstrates the Houthis' clear disregard for the well-being of the Yemeni people. UNVIM is key, UNVIM is key to facilitating these vital imports. We urge international donors to work together to provide adequate and predictable funding to strengthen UNVIM's inspection capacity and ability to prevent the flow of weapons. Finally, we call upon the Houthis to avoid dragging Yemen into a regional conflict through its continued attacks against Israel. It is vital that we bring to an end this cycle of violence and that the Houthis prioritize the needs of the Yemeni people. I reiterate the UK's call for urgent regional de-escalation and progress towards sustainable peace in Yemen. I thank you.
Je remercie la représentante
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom, and I give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Madam President, I have the honour to deliver this statement on behalf of members of the A3+, namely Algeria, Sierra Leone, Mozambique, and my own country, Guyana. We join other colleagues in thanking Special Envoy Hans Grunberg and Acting USG Joyce Msuya for their valuable briefings and take note of the contribution of Professor Juman on the situation in Yemen. We also welcome the participation of Yemen in this meeting. Madam President, as highlighted by the briefers, the humanitarian situation in Yemen remains dire, with the country enduring one of the most devastating crises in recent history. The arbitrary detention of UN staff and other humanitarian workers by the Houthis, a clear violation of international humanitarian law, has also impeded the humanitarian response to the detriment of the Yemeni people. The A3+ echoes the recent appeal of the Secretary General, as well as the principles of the affected United Nations agencies, for the release of all arbitrarily detained personnel in Yemen. Their freedom is essential for the effective delivery of humanitarian assistance and the pursuit of peace in Yemen. We are alarmed by the reported referral to criminal prosecution by the Houthi de facto authorities of a significant number of arbitrarily detained aid workers, including 3 United Nations personnel who were detained in 2021 and 2023, and renew our call for their immediate release and for full respect for their human rights. We deplore this unacceptable behavior and emphasize the need for humanitarian personnel to be allowed to operate without fear or obstruction. We further urge the Houthis to desist from further actions that impede efforts to provide humanitarian aid and protection to the millions of Yemenis in need, and to instead direct their attention to advancing the peace process. Madam President, after a decade of conflict, the Yemen peace process remains in a state of limbo, a product of a mutually hurting stalemate, the misaligned expectations among internal and external stakeholders, and shifting regional dynamics. All the while, it is the Yemeni people who continue to pay the ultimate price. The humanitarian crisis in Yemen is considered one of the most severe and complex in the world due to the scale of human suffering, the protracted nature of the conflict, counterproductive actions, and the geopolitical complexities that impede political progress. We reaffirm the urgent need for a Yemeni-led political and peace process, as advocated for by UN Special Envoy, to facilitate a peaceful and inclusive transition. We urge the conflict parties and regional and other stakeholders to refrain from actions that would deepen divisions or hinder dialogue. The A3+ acknowledges the significant diplomatic efforts undertaken by Mr. Grunberg, who has made strides in re-engaging regional actors and ensuring that Yemeni political voices are included in the peace process. His message throughout this process has been clear. Achieving peace in Yemen requires unified efforts from all stakeholders, both regionally and globally. Recent Israeli airstrikes on Houthi-controlled infrastructure represent a troubling escalation of regional tensions, raising the potential for a wider conflict that threatens the stability of the entire Middle East. The Houthi attacks in the Red Sea jeopardize the active maritime ecosystem in the Red Sea and continue to pose a threat to commercial activities. This vital maritime corridor for global trade has become increasingly unstable, driving up transportation costs and disrupting food and fuel supplies, not only for Yemen, but for the entire region. Maritime security is essential for global trade. The Houthis must cease these hostile operations immediately. The A3+ emphasizes the urgent need to secure these maritime routes and safeguard global commerce. We call on the Houthis to cease all attacks, which undermine navigational rights and freedoms. Considering these challenges, the A3+ firmly maintains that securing an immediate and permanent ceasefire in Gaza is a critical first step towards lasting peace throughout the region. This ceasefire is essential for halting further escalation and creating the environment for a genuine and comprehensive peace process. Madam President, the humanitarian dimension of the crisis in Yemen is critical. Approximately 24 million people in Yemen, about 80% of the population, require humanitarian assistance, marking one of the highest proportions of a population in need globally. This already dire situation is compounded by critical levels of food insecurity, with millions on the brink of famine, a devastated healthcare infrastructure, and reported outbreaks of preventable diseases such as cholera and diphtheria. The conflict has displaced over 4 million people internally, further complicating aid efforts. Despite the severity of the situation, Yemen has often been underrepresented in global media compared to other crises, leading to less public awareness and consequently less funding and aid. We urgently call on the international community to mobilize the necessary resources for the 2024 Humanitarian Response Plan for Yemen. Madam President, the military dynamics of this conflict, driven by both internal and external actors, continue to fuel instability. The A3+ condemns all attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure. We call for an immediate halt to such actions and urge all parties to adhere to international humanitarian law. A political resolution is non-negotiable. Yemen can only find its way out of this quagmire through dialogue and mutual respect for sovereignty. In this regard, we urge parties to the conflict, as well as other local stakeholders, including civil society, women, and youth groups, to actively participate in ongoing discussions being facilitated by UN Special Envoy. In closing, Madam President, the A3+ reiterates the necessity of a comprehensive approach to resolving the crisis in Yemen. We advocate for sustained humanitarian support, a revitalized political process, and unwavering respect for international humanitarian law. The people of Yemen deserve peace, and the world must not turn a blind eye to their suffering. We stand ready to support all efforts that lead to lasting peace and stability in Yemen and the region. I thank you.
Je remercie la représentante
I thank
du
the
Guyana
representative of Guyana and I invite the representative of Ecuador to take the floor.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Thank
you, Madam President. I'd like to thank Special Envoy Grunberg and Under Secretary General Masuya and Madam Najat Juman for their briefings, and also welcome the permanent representative of Yemen to this meeting. Madam President, I'd like to begin my statement by expressing Ecuador's condemnation of the new attacks perpetrated by the Houthis against Israel, which, together with the attacks on shipping in the Red Sea, are expanding the conflict in the Middle East and threatening stability in the region. My delegation takes note of the announcement by Israel that its aerial attacks on the ports of Hodeidah and Ras Issa were in response to the Houthi attacks, and we call upon the authorities to respect international law and international humanitarian law, complying with the criteria of necessity, distinction and proportionality. The fact that the Houthis have expressed that they will not cease their attacks is concerning, particularly due to the vicious cycle of reprisals that this has generated. Ecuador joins in the calls for maximum restraint to be shown in order to avoid a new escalation. These difficult circumstances have also had a negative impact on Yemen. Despite the fact that the levels of violence continue to be lower than they were in the period prior to the truce achieved in 2022, the armed clashes between the various factions are a reminder that a return to war continues to be present. That's why it's indispensable to maintain regional and international support for the mediation efforts of Special Envoy Grunberg in order to generate an environment that will make constructive dialogue possible to resume the path towards peace. And here we would like to support all of the activities that are carried out with the aim of strengthening the meaningful participation of women in the peace process in accordance with Resolution 1325. Colleagues, the humanitarian crisis in Yemen has worsened due to the increasing levels of food insecurity and the outbreak of cholera, in particular on the west coast. To this, there are seasonal rains that have caused damage and displacement throughout the country, affecting more than 500,000 people since July 2024. Women and children are amongst these most vulnerable groups, and they are facing ever greater risk, in particular the displaced families that are led by women, which represent more than 22% of those receiving emergency assistance. In this scenario, the provision of aid to those that need it the most is a humanitarian imperative that requires an operative environment that will guarantee safe access conditions. Humanitarian staff arbitrarily detained by the Houthis must be released immediately and unconditionally. Reports on the possible bringing of charges against them is unacceptable and further worsens the prolonged detention that they have had to endure. In conclusion, we lament the tragic incident that occurred a few days ago on the coast of Obok, where 45 migrants at least lost their lives, having been forced by traffickers to abandon their vessel. These kinds of tragedies show the urgent need to protect migrants along the entire eastern route from the Horn of Africa to Yemen and the Gulf. Thank you very much. I thank the representative of Ecuador and I invite the representative of France to take the floor. Thank you, Madam President. I would like to thank Hans Grunberg, Joyce Masuya and Madam Juman for their briefings. I would also like to welcome amongst us the permanent representative of Yemen. Madam President, France deplores the fact that the Houthis, supported by Iran, continue to destabilize the Red Sea with their attacks against commercial shipping, in spite of resolutions 2722 and 2739 adopted by this Council. States have the right to defend their vessels against these attacks in accordance with international law. The Houthis must immediately cease their destabilizing activities in the Red Sea. We call for the immediate release of the Galaxy leader and its crew detained since November 2023. France also firmly condemns the attacks carried out by the Houthis against Israel. These actions stoke escalation in the region, for which the Houthis bear a large part of the responsibility. France recalls its attachment to regional stability and support of our partners in the region. We will continue our work as part of the European Union Defence and security operation Aspides to protect maritime safety and the freedom of navigation in accordance with international law and working together with our partners. Madam President, France once again condemns the arbitrary detention of United Nations staff and staff of local and international NGOs. We demand their immediate release. We are extremely concerned at the consequences that these detentions will have on humanitarian operations, as well as the charges brought against those detained. These detentions are contrary to international humanitarian law and are hindering the humanitarian emergency response, particularly given the outbreak of cholera. We call upon the Houthis to do everything possible to make it possible for humanitarian actors to vaccinate the most vulnerable populations and put an end to the campaigns of disinformation that are being orchestrated against these humanitarian workers. We are concerned about the dramatic projections for 2025 with regard to humanitarian needs that continue to increase. Food insecurity is now affecting all regions of Yemen. The Houthis must stop taking the Yemeni civilian population hostage. The Yemenis are the first victims of the restrictions that they impose on humanitarian operations. France calls for safe and unimpeded humanitarian access. The international community must remain mobilized to respond to the needs of the civilian population. Madam President, the regional context must not make us lose sight of the importance of a resumption of peace negotiations under the aegis of Special Representative Grunberg, and France reiterates our full support to him, particularly in the implementation of his political roadmap. This is the only solution that will lead to a complete and lasting cessation of hostilities. The Houthis must come back to the table of negotiations conducted by the Special Envoys. France stresses the importance of having inclusive negotiations that will guarantee the participation of civil society and Yemeni women. I thank you.
Je remercie la représentante de la
France. I thank the representative of France, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President. And thank you, Special Envoy Grunberg, Acting Undersecretary General Masuya, and Ms. Juman for your briefings. Last week, we marked a solemn milestone, 1 year since Hamas's brutal October 7 terrorist attack on Israel. This week, we mark yet another grim anniversary, 1 year since the Houthis, seeking to exploit this devastation, launched cruise missiles and drones at Israel. Much has changed in the months since, and yet the Houthis continue to sow chaos and disruption, threatening international peace and security. Over the last year, the Houthis have taken the lives of innocent seafarers and disrupted essential imports to regional populations. They have boasted about their increasingly sophisticated weapons, which not only cause significant damage to passing ships, but threaten environmental disaster. And a few weeks ago, just hours after Israel eliminated the leader of Hezbollah, the Houthis fired a salvo of ballistic missiles at civilian infrastructure in Israel, including Ben Gurion International Airport. The Houthis are not acting alone. There is verifiable evidence they have been receiving weapons and military supplies from Iran in violation of the UN arms embargo. And there are alarming public reports. A permanent member of this council considered providing the Houthis with supersonic anti-ship ballistic missiles and may be negotiating to give them small arms. And so, it has never been more important to enforce the arms embargo established under Resolution 2216. Put simply, violators should know there will be costs to supplying arms to the Houthis. In addition, this Council should take steps to strengthen the UN verification and inspection mechanism. This mechanism is critical to stanching the flow of weapons to the Houthis. And yet, right now, it is hamstrung by funding gaps and personnel shortfalls. For our part, the United States has provided $1 million to UNVIM in 2024, and we have approached many capitals to request additional contribution to its 2025 budget with no restrictions. Now is the time for everyone to step up and provide the funds needed for UNVIM to hire additional monitors and fulfill its mission. Because frankly, it needs to fulfill its mission. This mechanism isn't perfect, but it is a way to ensure arms and related materiel are not illicitly smuggled to the Houthis by Iran or any other malign actor. Of course, the instability is hardly restricted to the Red Sea. Inside Yemen, we continue to see rampant injustice. Humanitarians, along with UN and embassy personnel, have been abducted. And we are extremely concerned the Houthis have reportedly started referring detainees to their so-called state security court, known for its use of video-recorded forced confessions, among other abuses. Let me be clear. No judicial process in the Houthis' hands has a shred of legitimacy. And we repeat our demand for the immediate release of those being held. Given these developments, the United States stands firm in our belief that the UN and international community cannot continue business as usual. The time has come for the UN to adjust its non-life-saving, non-life-sustaining programming and operations in Yemen to ensure the safety and security of all personnel. We were glad to see Acting Undersecretary General Masuya call for this recalibration last month. Now, the UN country team and its agencies in the field must take immediate action to implement it. Colleagues, the Yemeni people aspire for a freer, fairer, more prosperous future, for a country that respects their human rights and upholds their fundamental freedoms. Let us stand for a Yemeni political process that leads to a durable end to this conflict. And let us stand by the Yemeni people as they call for justice, accountability, and peace. Thank you, Madam President.
Je remercie le représentant des
I thank the
États-Unis et
representative
je
of the
passe la
United
parole
States
au
and I give the floor
représentant
to
de la
the
Slovénie.
representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Madam President. I also want to thank Special Envoy, Mr. Grunberg, Acting Undersecretary General, Masuya, as well as Dr. Juman for their briefings today, and I welcome Ambassador of Yemen in the chamber. Madam President, recent weeks have seen a dangerous escalation in the region, from which Yemen is regrettably not immune. We condemn the latest spiral of violence, which has seen Houthis attacks against Tel Aviv and Ashkelon, as well as renewed Israeli strikes against Hodeidah and Rasisa ports. We reiterate that attacks against civilian infrastructure and objects are prohibited under international law. We urge all actors to exercise maximum restraint and to do the utmost to contain the escalation and avoid embroiling Yemen further in the crisis. A dangerous and unending tit-for-tat is not in anyone's interest. In particular, we call on Houthis to focus on the needs and aspirations of Yemeni people first and foremost. We urge all Yemeni actors to display courage and determination to refocus efforts on an inclusive Yemeni peace process and the Special Envoy's roadmap. Dialogue can be the only way forward. Meanwhile, Madam President, the humanitarian needs of Yemenis on the ground are not subsiding, as we have just heard from the briefers. And the situation for humanitarians operating in Yemen continues to be extremely precarious. More than 100 days have passed since the detention by the Houthis of UN staff and other humanitarian and NGO workers. This is unacceptable, and we reiterate our calls for their immediate and unconditional release. We stress that UN personnel enjoy immunity from detention and that UN premises are inviolable. Slovenia is also concerned by the potential humanitarian impact of developments in the Red Sea and Yemen's western ports, whether they be unrelenting Houthis attacks against commercial shipping, which risk environmental catastrophe, or strikes against Hodeidah and Rasisa. It is vital that crucial waterways and port infrastructure remain open and functioning, particularly given Yemen's heavy reliance on imports. And while needs are soaring across the region, we urge donors to continue to prioritize Yemen's humanitarian crisis and the life-saving and life-sustaining work that OCHA and other humanitarian actors are carrying out on the ground across the country. Before concluding, I want to take the opportunity to highlight the plight of Yemeni children following a decade of brutal conflict. From recruitment to early marriage to facing increasing protection risks as a result of displacement and the highest risk from landmines and unexploding ordnance. Yemeni children continue to suffer the brunt of the war which they have played no part in creating. It is deeply distressing that while almost 40% of Yemen's children are now out of school and denied a regular education, others face indoctrination in Houthi summer camps, perpetuating an unending cycle of violence. Madam President, last month we adopted a Pact for the Future, including a declaration on future generations. All parties in Yemen must comply with their obligations under international humanitarian human rights law. This includes their obligations to the protection of Yemen's children. Otherwise, we risk losing an entire future generation. Thank you.
Je remercie le représentant de la Slovénie et je passe la parole à la représentante du Japon.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Special Envoy Grunberg and ASG Musuya for their informative briefings. My appreciation also goes to Dr. Juman on her sobering testimony. Yemen is at the brink. The country has been bearing hostilities, fragmentation, and a humanitarian crisis for a decade. And now it faces an increasing risk of being dragged into a wider regional conflict. We must halt the downward spiral as soon as possible. I wish to highlight 3 points for today's briefing. First, Japan strongly condemns the series of irresponsible conducts by the Houthis. The Houthis' reckless attacks towards Israel and aggravate the already dangerous situation in the Middle East. This must stop immediately. The Houthis must also cease their continued threats to international shipping and release the vessels and the crew members of the Galaxy Reader in accordance with Security Council Resolution 2722 and 2739. Since last year, global maritime transportation has been significantly disrupted, and the 25 innocent sailors have been held captive for nearly 330 days. This is totally unacceptable. The arbitrary detention of UN staff members and others for more than 4 months and judicial accusation is outrageous. These individuals were serving for the benefit of Yemens. Detaining them only impedes critical humanitarian assistance and human rights protection activities and worsens the dire situation in the country. Japan reiterates its demand for their immediate and unconditional release, as well as the release of those held in captivity for years. We also reject any criminal prosecutions against them. Second, Japan deeply regrets that the peace process has stalled amid regional escalation. This has led to growing insecurity and instability in Yemen. It is our firm belief that only a sustainable and inclusive dialogue among all Yemens, not violence or hatred, will pave the way for lasting peace in the country. We are encouraged to hear from Special Envoy that peace in Yemen is achievable. Japan continues to support his efforts to restore momentum and facilitate peace talks between the parties. Third, Japan remains seriously concerned about persisting food insecurity, diseases, and natural disasters in Yemen. The international community must scale up assistance to save over 18 million people suffering from the multifaceted humanitarian crisis. Their livelihoods heavily depend upon imports. To this end, last month, Japan committed to grant nearly $5 million to UNDP for a project to streamline the imports of food, humanitarian aid, and other goods at the port of Aden, an essential maritime facility in Yemen. Japan remains steadfast in working to realize peace and stability in Yemen in cooperation with the United Nations and fellow countries. I thank you, Madam President.
Je remercie la représentante du Japon et je passe la parole au
Japan,
représentant de Malte.
Representative of Malta.
Thank you, Madam President. And I also thank Special Envoy Grunberg, Acting Under Secretary General Msuya, and Professor Jaman for their briefings. I also welcome the Permanent Representative of Yemen to the Chamber today. Malta remains deeply concerned by the escalating tensions in the region, which continue to hamper progress towards peace in Yemen. For nearly a decade, the Yemeni people have suffered this protracted conflict. This translates into millions of people experiencing acute food insecurity, with some districts facing critical levels of malnutrition. Thousands of children are estimated to be acutely malnourished by the end of 2024. Millions of people have been internally displaced, many of them multiple times. They are suffering lack of water, healthcare, and sanitation services. Hundreds of migrants have lost their lives this year, making 2024 the deadliest year for migrant sea crossings between the Horn of Africa and Yemen. Preventable diseases like cholera continue to spread rapidly. These are aggravated by heavy seasonal rains affecting Yemen's fragile water and sanitation systems. The international community must act now to prevent greater suffering and loss of life. It must urgently scale up financial support to Yemen's humanitarian response plan, which remains underfunded. Despite the emergency, impediments to the delivery of humanitarian aid persist. We demand that movement restrictions on women be lifted to facilitate humanitarian access throughout the country. Malta condemns the arbitrary detention by the Houthis of UN personnel, staff from non-governmental organizations, and civil society representatives. We echo the Secretary General's demand for their immediate and unconditional release. These detentions are unprecedented and directly impede the delivery of humanitarian aid and protection to the 18.2 million people in need. We stress that while they are detained, they must be treated with full respect for international humanitarian law and human rights. This includes allowing them to contact their families and legal representatives. Madam President, as we have heard today from Professor Jaman, the economic situation for most Yemenis continues to decline. It remains a large driver of suffering. The effects of natural disasters and climate change also add to the challenges, disproportionately affecting the most vulnerable. Yemen's economy must be depoliticized. We call on all parties to engage in dialogue and collaborate on the economic front to strengthen the country's currency and economy. We urge parties to return to the negotiating table to engage on commitments made to the UN roadmap. They need to focus on agreeing to a nationwide ceasefire and the resumption of an inclusive, Yemeni-led and owned political process under UN auspices. We reiterate that any inclusive political process requires the full, equal, meaningful, and safe participation of women. We urge the UN and member states facilitating talks to put in place enhanced and targeted measures to achieve the 30% quota agreed in the National Dialogue Conference. Madam President, we condemn the Houthis' missile and drone attacks against Israel, as well as their continued attacks against vessels in the Red Sea. We are also very concerned by Israel's retaliatory attacks in Yemen that have led to loss of life and damaged critical infrastructure. We call on all parties to exercise maximum restraint, as further escalation of conflict will only exacerbate and prolong the suffering of the most vulnerable. I thank you.
Je remercie le représentant de Malte et je passe la parole au représentant de la République de Corée.
Thank you. Thank you, President. My appreciation goes to Special Envoy Hans Grundberg, OCHA Acting USG Joyce Msuya, Dr. Najat Juman for their briefing. I also welcome the participation of the Permanent Representative of Yemen. The Middle East is facing a grave escalation of conflicts. The situation in Yemen is also deteriorating and compounding the pain of Yemeni people. Indeed, the region is ablaze with multiple crises that could further escalate into a wider regional war, particularly if these multi-front fires ignite simultaneously. The Houthis' ongoing attacks against vessels in the Red Sea and missile and drone strikes targeting Israel, along with cooperation with so-called axis of resistance, risk pouring more fuel on the regional fire. At this pivotal moment, I wish to make the following points. First, we urge all UN member states, including neighboring countries, to fully implement all relevant Security Council resolutions, including the targeted arms embargo. The final report of the panel of experts shows the unprecedented scale and nature of military material transfers, including financial support and training, in violation of Resolution 2216. It serves as a stark reminder of the urgent need for stricter compliance with the Security Council resolutions. Second, we express our deep concerns over the recent alarming developments regarding Houthis' referral to criminal prosecution of those arbitrarily detained in Yemen, including 3 UN personnel. These measures are all the more astonishing as they further undermine the critical international assistance for the sake of the long-suffering Yemeni people. We strongly support the press release issued by the principals of affected UN entities and international NGOs last weekend and unequivocally call for the immediate and unconditional release of all detainees. Third, the worsening economic crisis due to flooding and financial sector disorder undercuts efforts to foster meaningful dialogue. Arbitrary economic measures and tit-for-tat countermeasures between the Houthis and the government of Yemen will only aggravate humanitarian crisis for Yemenis. It is regrettable there has been no new positive developments based on the economic de-escalation agreement in July. We call on the Houthis to refrain from additional hostile economic measures and to engage with the Yemeni government to move forward in tackling economic challenges. President, the Republic of Korea is fully committed to supporting Yemen's path to durable peace and reaffirms its unwavering support for the efforts of Special Envoy Hans Grundberg, humanitarian workers, and OCHA. Kickstarting the stalled political process under the auspices of the United Nations is long overdue. To do so, parties must prioritize ending violence and conflict to turn a new leaf for Yemen's future. And in particular, the Houthis should not utilize the Gaza crisis as an excuse for its belligerent actions. Thank you, Madam President.
Je remercie le représentant de la République de Corée et j'invite le représentant de la Chine à prendre la parole.
China.
主席，
President.
我要感谢格伦德伯格特使和米苏亚代理秘书长的通报。我也认真听取了朱曼女士的发言，也欢迎也门代表出席今天的会议。过去几周，加沙冲突持续延宕，离以局势急剧恶化，负面外溢效应不断显现。胡塞武装加对以色列发动打击，以色列对荷台达港、拉斯伊萨港发动攻击，中方对当前事态及其未来走向深感担忧，认为当务之急是推动局势降温，防止冲突扩大。我呼吁所有当事方保持冷静克制，避免采取任何刺激紧张局势、进一步升级的行动。对话协商是解决也门问题的唯一正确选择。我们呼吁有关各方坚持政治解决大方向，通过对话协商解决分歧，共同推进也人主导、也人所有的全面政治进程。各方应秉持善意，共同推动落实银行和航空问题协议，逐步积累互信。格伦德伯格特使为解决也门
Special Envoy Grundberg has made positive mediation efforts to resolve the Yemeni issue. China appreciates this and calls on all parties to support the work of the Special Envoy in order to make tangible progress in the political settlement of the Yemeni issue as soon as possible.
The continuing tension in the Red Sea does not serve the common interests of the international community. China once again calls on the Houthis to respect the right of navigation of commercial ships of all countries in the Red Sea in accordance with international law and to cease the attacks in order to maintain the safety of waterways in the Red Sea. All parties concerned should remain calm and exercise restraint and stop actions that exacerbate tensions. China is deeply concerned about the humanitarian situation in Yemen and calls on the international community to increase its humanitarian and development efforts in Yemen and strengthen its support to the Yemeni government to improve people's livelihoods. China is gravely concerned about the detention of UN personnel in Yemen. We note that the Houthis has allowed some of the detained to contact the outside. We encourage all parties to strengthen communication to facilitate the unconditional release of all UN personnel as soon as possible. President, the situation in Yemen is closely linked to the situation in the Middle East. The year-long conflict in Gaza has already caused an unprecedented humanitarian disaster and is increasingly dragging the entire region into the quagmire of war and conflict. At this critical moment, the situation must not be allowed to deteriorate further and go down a road of no return. The Security Council must remain united and take measures to stop reckless military adventures in disregard of the consequences that widen the conflagration. We should push for the permanent ceasefire in Gaza and de-escalation of the tension between Lebanon and Israel to avoid a bigger catastrophe in the Middle East. In conclusion, I would like to reiterate that China is ready to work with the international community to continue to make unremitting efforts for a political solution to the Yemeni issue and for the maintenance of peace and stability in the Middle East. Thank you, President.
Je remercie le représentant de la Chine et j'invite le représentant de la Fédération de Russie.
Madam President, признательны спецпосланнику Хансу Гринбергу и исполняющему обязанности заместителя генерального секретаря по гуманитарным вопросам Джойс Мсуя за представленные доклады. Внимательно выслушали также профессора Джумана. Госпожа председатель, градус напряженности в Йемене не спадает. Более того, обстановка имеет тенденцию к обострению. Из-за все большего втягивания Йемена в более широкий региональный конфликт на фоне продолжающегося насилия в секторе Газа,
in Gaza, Lebanon, and other areas in the Middle East.
We would like to underscore the constant position Russia has had. We support the safety of international navigation in the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden, and other seas. We think that Ansar Allah should stop any actions which impede the freedom of navigation, which present a danger for commercial vessels, including oil tankers, and we call for an immediate release of the Galaxy leader and its crew. But we are convinced that in order to really stabilize the situation in the seas off the coast of Yemen, what needs to happen is equal pressure exerted on the members of the so-called coalition led by the United States and the UK, who continue weakly and quite indiscriminately attacking territory of this sovereign country in violation of international law. This destabilizing activity by them leads us to the thinking of their real reasons, which are very far, we think, from attaining the genuine settlement in Yemen within the existing parameters. But this is a similar pattern that our Western partners also use in other countries and regions. We would like to underscore that striking Yemen is unacceptable. At the same time, we want to say that destroying its port infrastructure could have the most dire humanitarian consequences. All of those who watch the region see very clear that what would help stabilizing the situation in the Red Sea would be first and foremost by ending the aggressive military campaign by Israel in Gaza, Lebanon, and Syria. Madam President, regardless of the prospects for the settlement of the Middle East as a whole, we think it's important to continue the active political and diplomatic work with the political forces in Yemen. Alongside strengthening the recent progress in resolving the internal differences in the economic area in Yemen, we need to continue advancing towards finalizing our work on the roadmap for the political process in the country. We note it's important to make sure there's alignment between the international efforts and regional actors when they're aimed at helping parties to the conflict come together. Furthermore, what remains relevant is renewing the legal basis for the Yemeni settlement so as to reflect the realities on the ground. In order to resolve these and other issues, we intend to continue very closely coordinating our approaches with all Yemeni actors, including Ansar Allah, call upon them to find mutually acceptable solutions and build trust. We're also ready to continue supporting the Special Envoy Grunberg. We had consultations with him in Moscow last week. Madam President, unfortunately, the very difficult humanitarian and socio-economic situation in the country continues. 2/3 of the population need humanitarian assistance. More than 3 million people do not have enough food. We think that the international community and donors should prioritize this issue. We note the mediation work done by regional actors who are already helping Yemenis in the financial and humanitarian tracks. The people of this long-suffering country should have unimpeded access to foodstuffs, medicines, and other essential goods, regardless of where they live. Any restrictions on humanitarian supplies and impeding the work of humanitarians are unacceptable. We'd like to express our concern having to do with the detention by Ansar Allah of the local UN staff. We'd like to recall in this context of the privileges and immunities by UN staff, such steps have a negative impact on the UN and humanitarian work in the country, and this is something that, of course, hits the ordinary people first and foremost. At the same time, double standards should be avoided. Some Western countries desire to sound an alarm when it comes to the UN personnel issues in Yemen are in stark contrast with their reaction, or rather almost total absence of reaction when it comes to the death of UN staff in Gaza as a result of Israeli strikes, and when it comes to the onslaught of the IDF against the interim forces in Lebanon, who nonetheless continue discharging their duty. It is important to expand this principled position by our Western colleagues to UNRWA, which the Israeli authorities are trying to force out of the Palestinian territory, and we call on all Council members to not allow such egregious and blatant double standards. I thank you.
Je remercie le représentant de la Fédération de Russie et je me permets de faire une déclaration en ma qualité de représentant de la Suisse. Je voudrais, comme mes collègues, remercier l'envoyé spécial Hans Grunberg, la secrétaire générale adjointe aux affaires humanitaires interim Joyce Msuya et l'économiste Najat Juman de leurs interventions. Je salue aussi la participation du représentant permanent du Yémen. Si la paix n'a pas de prix, la guerre, elle, par contre, a un coût au Yémen. Le PIB s'est effondré de moitié en 10 ans de conflit. Destruction des infrastructures, fuite des cerveaux et des capitaux, impact sur la circulation des personnes et des marchandises, division des institutions économiques, instauration d'une économie de guerre et mesures de rétorsion économique. Comme l'a souligné la professeure Najat Juman, les répercussions du conflit sur l'économie se manifestent sous de multiples formes. Et un constat demeure, c'est la population civile qui en fait les frais. Aujourd'hui, les Yéménites sont confrontés à une situation économique et humanitaire extrêmement difficile. 4 Yéménites sur 5 vivent dans la pauvreté. Plus de 18 millions de personnes ont besoin d'une aide humanitaire pour répondre aux besoins de base tels que l'accès aux soins ou à la nourriture. La prolongation du conflit dans le domaine économique perturbe l'approvisionnement et le transport des marchandises, générant une dynamique inflationniste artificielle. Cette situation exacerbe l'insécurité alimentaire, déjà alarmante, avec 64% de la population n'ayant pas accès à une nourriture suffisante. Malgré ces besoins aigus, les acteurs et actrices humanitaires doivent opérer dans un environnement difficile. Nous restons très
we
préoccupés par
remain
la
very
détention
concerned
arbitraire
about the
d'une partie
arbitrary
du personnel
detention of
humanitaire
some
et onusien.
humanitarian and UN
Le lancement de
personnel.
procédures pénales à
The
leur
initiation
encontre,
of
dont
criminal
fait état
proceedings
certains
against them,
rapports,
as mentioned
est
in
un
certain
développement
reports,
inquiétant.
is a worrying
La Suisse
development.
réitère l'appel de
Switzerland
l'ONU,
reiterates
déjà
the
entendu
UN's
plusieurs fois
appeal, which has
aujourd'hui et
already
de
been
manière
heard several
constante ces
times
derniers mois.
here today and
Le personnel
consistently in
humanitaire et
recent months,
onusien
that
détenu doit être
humanitarian and
libéré
UN personnel
immédiatement et
detained
sans
must
condition.
be released
De
immediately and
plus, l'accès
unconditionally.
humanitaire sûr
In
et sans
addition,
entrave
safe and
doit
unhindered
être garanti
humanitarian
sur
access
l'ensemble du
must be
territoire.
guaranteed throughout the country.
Comme l'a justement constaté Madame Najat
As Madame
Juman,
Najat
dans cette
Juman
situation
quite
déjà
rightly pointed
précaire,
out,
le
in
Yémen
this
ne peut
already
pas se
precarious
permettre
situation,
d'être entraîné dans
Yemen
une guerre
cannot afford to be
régionale.
dragged into
À
a
ce
regional
titre,
war.
les différentes
In
frappes
this
rapportées
respect,
ces dernières semaines nous
we are
préoccupent
deeply concerned by the
profondément.
various
Nous
strikes
condamnons
reported
cette
in recent
escalade
weeks.
de violence.
We condemn this
Le droit
escalation of
international, y
violence.
compris le droit
International law,
international
including
humanitaire,
international
en
humanitarian
particulier les
law,
principes de
in particular the
proportionnalité,
principles of
de
proportionality,
distinction et de
distinction
précaution
and
doivent
precaution
impérativement
must be
être respectés par
respected
toutes les
by all
parties.
parties.
Les infrastructures civiles ne
Civilian
doivent pas être
infrastructure
prises
must
pour
not be
cible.
targeted.
À ce titre, nous souhaitons rappeler
In this
l'importance
respect, we
du
wish
port
to
de
recall the
Hodeïda,
importance
qui
of the
reste
port
le
of
point d'entrée
Hodeïda, which
principal
remains
de
the
l'aide
main port of
humanitaire pour
entry
une
for
grande partie du
humanitarian
Yémen.
aid for a large
Nous
part of
exhortons
Yemen.
toutes les parties à
We urge
renoncer
all
à toute
parties to
escalade.
refrain from
Le
any
dialogue est la
escalation.
seule
Dialogue
option.
is the only option.
Nous l'avons entendu, seule une
We
solution
have heard
politique
it said
permettra de
only a
soulager la
political
population
solution will
yéménite de l'impact
relieve the Yemeni
économique et
population
humanitaire
of
du
the
conflit.
economic and
La
humanitarian
Suisse appelle
impact of the
toutes les
conflict.
parties avec de
Switzerland
l'influence,
calls on all parties with
inclus au sein de
influence,
ce
including
Conseil,
within this
à
Council,
s'engager en faveur
to
d'une
commit
telle
themselves
solution
to
et
such
au
a solution
respect
and
des droits
for
humains au
human
Yémen.
rights in Yemen to
À
be
ce titre, la
respected.
Suisse relève le
In this
travail
regard, Switzerland
inlassable
notes the
de
tireless
l'envoyé
work of
spécial Hans
Special Envoy
Grunberg et
Hans
de son
Grunberg
équipe.
and his team.
Nous lui
reiterate
réitérons notre
our
plein
full
soutien.
support for him.
Nous saluons aussi ses efforts
We
pour
also
la mise en
welcome his
œuvre de
efforts to
l'accord
implement
sur
the
le secteur
agreement on the
économique
economic sector
conclu en juillet
concluded
dernier,
last
dont
July,
nous appelons au
which
plein
we
respect.
call for to be fully
La Suisse se
respected.
félicite de
Switzerland
l'unité du
welcomes the unity
Conseil
of the
en
Council
faveur d'un
in
processus
favour
de
of a
paix au
peace
Yémen
process in
sous
Yemen
l'égide de
under
l'envoyé
the aegis
spécial
of the
qui a
Special
prévalu
Envoy,
depuis le
which
début
has
du
prevailed
conflit.
since the beginning
Nous
of the
nous devons de
conflict.
continuer
We
notre
must continue
engagement
our
sans faille
unwavering
dans ce
commitment in this
sens.
direction.
Rien n'est en
After
effet
all,
plus précieux
nothing
que
is
la
more
paix.
precious than
Je vous
peace.
remercie.
Thank you.
Et je reprends mes fonctions de président du Conseil et je donne à présent la parole au représentant du Yémen.
Allow me, Madam President, to congratulate you on assuming the presidency of the Council this month. I thank the permanent representative of the friendly country of Slovenia for his successful presidency last month. I thank the briefers.
تؤكد الحكومة اليمنية مجددا التزامها بنهج السلام الشامل العادل والمستدام وكانت ولا زالت تدعو إلى حياة السلام لتحقيق الأمن والاستقرار والتنمية والحياة الطبيعية لليمنيين.
Development and ensuring natural life for the Yemeni people. The government is still making tireless efforts to achieve a political solution to the conflict according to the agreed-upon terms of reference, namely the GCC initiative and its implementation mechanism, the outcomes of the National Dialogue Conference, and Security Council resolutions. Most notably Resolution 2216. We reiterate our support to the Special Envoy of the Secretary General and all regional and international efforts aiming to end this conflict and achieving peace in Yemen. I especially thank our brethren in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Sultanate of Oman for their efforts that aim to pave the way for a political solution and resolving the Yemeni crisis. Since toppling the constitutional legitimacy and national consensus, Houthi militias have been causing wars, crises, tragedies, and divisions. They have been committing the worst human rights violations. They've been destroying the lives of children by recruiting them and pushing them to the battlefield. They've been planting millions of mines. They've been pursuing the policy of systematic impoverishment and starvation to humiliate and subjugate Yemenis in areas under their control. They've been destroying the national economy, creating a parallel economy to finance their wars. They've been taking the lives of Yemenis. They've been depriving Yemenis of their security, stability, food, their present and their future. They've been destroying the social fabric. They've been hollowing out the education system. They've destroyed health facilities and cultural centers, and they've spread ignorance with all possible ways to alter the national identity. The terrorists, the Houthi militias, have proven once again that they're not committed to peace or the interest of the Yemeni people. The international community have been lax in dealing with these militias, and they've been supported by the Iranian regime. As a result, they evaded their responsibilities in achieving peace. They've continued their military escalation. They've continued with violations of international humanitarian law, international human rights law, national legislation, and they've continued to threaten international navigation in the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, which has disastrous effects on the marine environment and the economic and humanitarian situation in Yemen and in countries bordering the Red Sea. In this context, we reiterate the message conveyed by Dr. Rashad Mohammed Al-Halimi, the chairman of the Presidential Leadership Council, in his statement before the General Assembly. I quote, "To avoid an expansion and perpetuation of this escalation, there is an urgent need for a collective approach to support the Yemeni government and enhance its institutional capacities to protect its regional waters and secure its national territories. Without addressing these needs, the militias will not engage with any efforts to achieve peace and will not cease its extortion and will not cease to threaten regional international peace and security." End of quote. The Yemeni government calls upon the international community and this august council to fulfill its responsibility and implement its resolutions pertaining to the Yemeni crisis, including banning the flow of Iranian weapons, drying up financing sources, and bringing pressure to bear on the Houthi militias to choose the path of peace and engage positively with peace efforts and end the humanitarian suffering that has been going on for way too long. Madam President, the Yemeni government continues to work on economic, financial, and administrative reforms to address issues related to the lives and livelihood of Yemenis and to alleviate their suffering within existing resources. The government has continued to implement strict measures to ensure accountability and transparency and combat corruption, increase economic resources, and optimally use foreign aid to respond to the needs and implement government priorities. The aim is to ensure economic stability, ensure the stability of the national currency, despite pressures on the economy and the decline of resources as a result of Houthi militias targeting oil exporting facilities since October 2022 in its continued systematic economic and military wars. The Yemeni government calls upon the international community once again to provide support to address the deteriorating humanitarian and economic situation and lay the foundation for a long-term economic recovery. This includes immediate humanitarian aid to alleviate the suffering and build stronger accountability mechanisms, especially in the areas under the control of the militias. This also includes bigger investments in civilian infrastructure, in health and education, sustainable development, and in enhancing national capacities to mitigate the effects of climate change that led to hundreds of casualties and displaced thousands over the past 2 months. Madam President, Houthi militias continue to obstruct, steal, and divert humanitarian aid. They are committing the worst violations against humanitarian actions in areas under its control. Most recently, they've kidnapped scores of staff of international and local organizations operating in Yemen, including UN organizations. This was followed by a number of arbitrary and extortive measures against agencies and their staff. 4 months have passed, and these staff members remain detained, forcibly disappeared, in fact. Their families have no information about their whereabouts or their health conditions. 4 months have passed, and these detained people are in secret prisons, subjected to torture, cruel, degrading, and inhumane treatment. 4 months have passed, and the families of the victims and the humanitarian community as a whole looks to this august council, looks to the United Nations to take decisive action to protect UN staff and save their lives, especially as they were recently referred to the so-called criminal prosecution in preparation for issuing unjust verdicts against them. They would join dozens of others that faced this fate, which is something that we've warned of. It has become urgent to intensify efforts and to increase international pressures to ensure the immediate and unconditional release of the detained and ensure the accountability for these crimes. The Yemeni government calls once again for relocating the headquarters of the UN agencies and headquarters of international organizations operating in Yemen to the temporary capital in Aden to ensure an environment that allows the agencies to work effectively and to serve those in need and to ensure the safety and security of humanitarian workers. In conclusion, Madam President, the patient Yemeni people looks to sustainable peace that fulfills its aspirations, that champions the policy of the state, promoting rights, freedoms, justice, equality, and national partnership, and to enhance democracy, as opposed to the policy of appropriation, marginalization, injustice, and divine selectivity. Peace in Yemen will prevail, and the hopes of Yemenis to regain their country, to achieve peace, security, and development will turn to reality. I thank you, Madam President.
Je remercie le représentant du Yémen. Il n'y a plus d'orateurs ou d'oratrices inscrits sur la liste. J'invite à présent les membres du Conseil à poursuivre l'examen de la question dans le cadre de consultation. La séance est levée.